The polished marble of the Lagos banquet hall felt worlds away from the sun-scorched asphalt of the Oshodi market. Yet as David stood before the microphone, the phantom weight of a water basin still seemed to press against his neck. In 2015, he had been the prince of a gated government residence, the son of a formidable police commissioner whose word was law. By the time the Harmattan winds of the following year arrived, he was a ghost in tattered clothes, hawking pure water and plastic bags just to buy a strip of antacids for his ailing mother. His life had been a series of cruel subtractions. First his father's life, then their home, and finally his own voice, which had withered into a terrified stutter under the weight of his Uncle Sagan's belt. Between 2016 and 2019, David lived as a shadow in a mansion of gold, a houseboy who was told he was nothing, punished for being innocent, and forbidden from even whispering his mother's name. But beneath the trauma and the heart palpitations that raced like a trapped bird in his chest, a new strength was being forged in the heat of the school stage. The boy who was forced to eat scraps after the house went silent was secretly memorizing lines that would eventually take him across the ocean, transforming a broken, introverted orphan into the most sought-after voice in the country. The transformation began not with a bang, but with the sudden, haunting silence of a siren that had once announced safety. In the lush, guarded corridors of a government-reserved area in Lagos, 2015 was a year of golden light. 7-year-old David lived in a world defined by the crisp starch of his father's police uniform and the sweet, lingering scent of his mother's expensive imported perfumes. His father, Commissioner John, was a man of titanium resolve, a pillar of the Nigerian police force whose presence commanded the very air in the room. His mother, Grace, was a queen of commerce, her laughter ringing through the house as she coordinated shipments of lace and ankara from her thriving boutique. They lived in a sprawling white bungalow provided by the state, where the lawns were manicured to a golf course finish and the generator hummed a steady, reassuring lullaby against the Lagos heat. David's biggest worry was whether his father would bring home a new action figure or if he would be allowed an extra 30 minutes of television before bed. He was a child of privilege, his footsteps light on the polished terrazzo floors, his future seemingly carved in marble. Then, the music stopped. It happened on a Tuesday. The rain was drumming against the roof, a heavy, tropical downpour that blurred the world outside. Commissioner John never came home. The news arrived via a somber delegation of officers, their caps held against their chests, their eyes refusing to meet Grace's. A tactical operation gone wrong. An ambush on the outskirts of the city. In the blink of an eye, the man who was David's son had been eclipsed. The immediate aftermath was a blur of black cloth and the hollow sound of earth hitting a casket. But as the funeral flowers wilted, so did the protection of the state. Within months, their official letters began to arrive. The tone was polite but cold. The government residence was required for the incoming officer. The pension, they were told, was under processing, a bureaucratic black hole that swallowed their security hole. Grace, paralyzed by grief and a sudden, mysterious ailment that clawed at her stomach, watched as her business partners vanished. Debtors who owed her millions suddenly developed amnesia. The vibrant woman who once commanded a boutique was now a shadow, huddled in bed, clutching a photograph of a man in uniform. The move was the first true shock. They traded the white bungalow for a single, humid room in a face-me-I-face-you tenement in a crowded suburb. The air here didn't smell of jasmine. It smelled of open gutters, charcoal smoke, and desperation. The transition was brutal. The 2016 Harmattan winds brought a biting dust that settled on their few remaining belongings, mocking their former life. Grace's health plummeted. The doctors spoke of stress-induced ulcers and chronic complications, but without money for the private clinics they once frequented, she was left to suffer on a thin mattress. David, at only 7 years old, realized that the daily bread his father used to pray over was no longer guaranteed. He watched his mother's eyes grow hollow, her skin losing its luster until she looked like parchment. "I will go, Mama," David whispered one morning, his voice still high and innocent. "I will bring money." He didn't return to his private school. Instead, he found himself at the edge of the Lagos motor parks, a small figure lost in a sea of shouting conductors and exhaust fumes. He started by selling transparent plastic bags to commuters, then graduated to pure water, chilled sachets carried in a heavy plastic basin balanced on his head. The weight of the water was the first thing that broke him. It pressed down on his neck, making his spine ache with a dull, throbbing rhythm. But the emotional weight was heavier. He saw boys his age in neat school uniforms, their bags slung over their shoulders, laughing as they boarded yellow buses. David would duck his head, hiding behind his basin, terrified that a former classmate might recognize the commissioner's son. Each day was a battle for survival. He learned to navigate the hierarchy of the streets, how to avoid the area boys who demanded a cut of his meager earnings, and how to spot the kind-faced women who might tip him an extra 5 naira. By the time the sun began to set, His legs would be trembling, but his hand would be clamped tight over the small bundle of crumpled notes in his pocket. His priority was never food for himself. It was the white strips of antacids for his mother. He would run to the local chemist, his heart racing, to buy the medicine that offered her a few hours of peace. In that small, stifling room, he became the parent, and she became the child. As 2016 bled into 2017, the silence of his father's family became deafening. They were wealthy people, uncles with oil contracts and aunts with houses in London, but they had scrubbed David and Grace from their memories like a stain. The commissioner is gone, they seemed to say, and so is our obligation. One afternoon, in the chaos of a crowded market, David was weaving through the crowd, his voice hoarse from shouting ice water, cold water, when a hand suddenly gripped his arm. He flinched, expecting a thief or a policeman. Instead, he looked up into the shocked, horrified eyes of Aunt Beatrice. She was draped in expensive silk, her gold jewelry glinting in the harsh sun, looking like a vision from a world David had almost forgotten. "David," she gasped, her voice trembling. Is that really you?" David couldn't speak. He looked down at his calloused feet, at his dirt-streaked shirt, and at the basin of water that defined his new reality. In that moment, the first crack appeared in his speech. He tried to say her name, to explain, to ask for help, but all that came out was a jagged, repetitive sound. Bibi. Bibi. The stutter had arrived, born from the sheer, crushing weight of shame. The transition from the scorched pavement of the Lagos markets to the chilled, marble-clad silence of Uncle Sagan's mansion was not a rescue. It was a relocation of suffering. Phase 2 of David's journey, spanning the tumultuous years of 2016 and 2017, is the era of the Gilded Cage. This was the period where the physical hunger of the streets was replaced by a psychological starvation, a systematic dismantling of a child's spirit within the very walls that should have offered him sanctuary. When the black SUV pulled up to the gates of the mansion in the upscale suburbs of Lagos, David felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with his mother's illness. He sat in the back seat, his small frame swallowed by the leather upholstery, clutching a black nylon bag that contained his entire life, a change of worn clothes and a half-empty strip of antacids he had bought for his mother that morning. The gates groaned open like the jaws of a leviathan. As they rolled up the driveway, David saw the fountain, a stone angel pouring water into a basin. To David, water was something you carried on your head until your neck snapped. Seeing it wasted for decoration felt like a personal insult to his recent past. Aunt Beatrice led him inside, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, but her touch lacked the warmth of his mother's. She was performing an act of charity, and like all performances, it felt choreographed. The air conditioning hit David like a wall of ice. It was a sharp contrast to the humid, sweat-soaked face-me-face room where his mother lay gasping for air. "Stay here," Beatrice whispered, pointing to a high-backed chair in the foyer. "I need to talk to your uncle." David Saturday. He looked at his feet, cracked, dusty, and looking entirely out of place on the cream-colored tiles. He waited for what felt like hours as the sun began to dip, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. From behind a heavy oak door, he heard the muffled thunder of a man's voice. "I told you, Beatrice. We are not an orphanage. His father is dead, his mother is a failure. Why must I bring that bad luck into my house? He is family, Sagan. Think of the optics. People are asking where the commissioner's son is. Do you want them to find him selling pure water at Oshodi?" The door swung open. Uncle Sagan emerged, a mountain of a man dressed in a flowing white agbada that seemed to radiate power. He didn't look at David with pity. He looked at him with the clinical disgust one might reserve for a cockroach found in a soup bowl. That first night, while the rest of the house slept, David couldn't close his eyes. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet. He crept out of the guest room, his heart hammering against his ribs, hoping to find a phone to call the neighbor who was looking after his mother. He found Uncle Sagan in the study. The room smelled of expensive cigars and old money. Sagan was sitting behind a desk, counting stacks of crisp Naira notes, the rubber bands snapping with rhythmic precision. He didn't look up when David entered, yet he knew the boy was there. "Come closer, boy," Sagan commanded. David stepped into the light. The stutter that had begun in the market now felt like a physical lump in his throat. You uncle, Emma my mother." Sagan slammed a stack of cash onto the desk. The sound was like a gunshot. "Listen to me, and listen well. You are here because my wife has a soft heart, not because you earned a seat at this table. In this house, your mother does not exist. She is a memory of a life you have lost. If I hear her name cross your lips, or if you try to contact that woman, I will throw you back into the gutter before the sun rises. David's eyes welled with tears, but Sagan wasn't finished. You will work for your bread. You will wake before the sun. You will scrub the floors of the balconies. You will wash the cars. And when you go to school, you will tell no one who your father was. You are a charity case, David. Act like one. David tried to protest, but his tongue betrayed him. He stood there, trembling, as his uncle looked through him as if he were made of glass. That night, the heart palpitations began, a rapid, irregular drumbeat in his chest that would become his constant companion for the next 2 years. By mid-2016, David's life had settled into a brutal, clockwork rhythm. While his cousins, Toby and Remy, slept in until 7 a.m., David was awake at 4:30 a.m. The Lagos mornings were often misty and cool, but David was drenched in sweat as he scrubbed the sprawling balconies with a brush that felt too large for his 7-year-old hands. He had to ensure not a single streak remained on the glass or the tiles. If Uncle Sagan found a spot of dust, David's breakfast, usually a cold piece of bread and a cup of watery tea, was forfeited. The each for himself, God for all motto of the family was practiced with religious fervor. When David was finished with the floors, he moved to the driveway. He washed the 3 black SUVs, the soapy water stinging the cuts on his hands. He did all this in silence. The boy who once talked incessantly about becoming a pilot was now a mute servant. School was no refuge. Sagan had enrolled him in a local school, but David was forbidden from riding in the car with his cousins. He walked the 3 miles, his oversized uniform flapping in the wind. In the classroom, he was the introvert. He sat at the back, his head down, terrified that the teacher would call on him to read. When he did speak, the stutter was so violent that the other children would erupt in laughter. David is a motorcycle. They would jeer, mimicking the sound of his struggling voice. He would return home to find more chores. The evening meal was a ritual of humiliation. David was not allowed to sit at the dining table. He waited in the kitchen until the family had finished, eating whatever scraps were left on the plates. Sometimes, Toby would purposefully mash his leftovers into a paste just to watch David try to eat it. The physical abuse was unpredictable, which made it more terrifying. It wasn't always about a mistake. Sometimes, it was simply because Uncle Sagan had had a bad day at the office or a business deal had fallen through. One evening in early 2017, a ceramic vase was knocked over in the hallway. David hadn't even been in that part of the house. He had been in the backyard hanging laundry. Yet, when Sagan came home, he didn't ask who did it. He called for David. I didn't. David started, his knees shaking. Don't lie to me. Sagan roared. He unbuckled his heavy leather belt. David wasn't allowed to cry out. He wasn't allowed to say he was unhappy. He had to take the blows in a silence that felt like it was suffocating him. That night, David lay on the floor of his small room, his back burning, his heart skipping beats. The fear had become a physical entity living inside him. He began to withdraw further, his eyes losing their spark, his posture hunching as if he were trying to disappear into himself. He missed his mother with an ache that felt like a hole in his chest. He wondered if she was still alive, if she was still taking the medicine he had bought her with his pure water money. But the threat of the gutter kept him silent. He was a prisoner in a mansion, a boy with a dead father's name and a living mother's heart, trapped in a cycle of trauma that seemed to have no end. Despite the darkness, 2017 brought a flicker of light. In the back of his mind, David began to realize that his uncle's words, that he was nothing and worthless, were lies. He was intelligent. He could solve math problems in his head while scrubbing the floors. He could memorize entire chapters of his textbooks just by looking at them once. He began to realize that while they could control his body and his voice, they couldn't control the world inside his head. In the quiet moments before sleep, he would imagine himself on a stage, speaking to thousands, his voice clear and resonant, no longer a ghost or a houseboy, but a man who had survived the storm. Phase 2 was the refining fire. The stutter, the heart problems, and the introversion were the scars of his battle, but they were also the evidence that he was still standing. The time of the silent echo was coming to an end, and the stage was being set for a transformation that no one in the mansion could have predicted. The year 2017 arrived in Lagos not with a celebration, but with a relentless, sweltering heat that seemed to bake the very walls of Uncle Sagan's mansion. For David, now 9 years old, the passage of time was marked only by the shifting patterns of chores and the deepening silence of his own voice. The boy who had once been the talkative pride of a police commissioner was now a shadow that glided through the hallways, a ghost with a stutter so profound it felt like a physical barrier between him and the rest of humanity. His heart palpitations had become a regular, terrifying companion. Sometimes, While scrubbing the grout in the master bathroom, his chest would begin to gallop like a trapped animal, a direct physical manifestation of the chronic fear that Uncle Sagan's voice instilled in him. He was a child living in a state of high alert, his nervous system frayed by 2 years of each for himself and God for all, a motto that, in this house, meant David was always the last to be considered and the first to be blamed. The shift began on a dusty Tuesday afternoon at the local community school David was allowed to attend. The school was a world away from the private British curriculum academies his cousins attended. Here, the blackboards were pitted and the ceiling fans hummed with a tired, metallic groan. Enter Mr. Okoro. He was a man who seemed composed of mismatched parts. Tall, spindly, with thick-rimmed glasses and a voice that vibrated with the resonance of a cello. He was the new literature and drama teacher, a man who believed that every child carried a secret universe inside them. While other teachers ignored the stuttering boy at the back of the class, Mr. Okoro watched David. He watched the way David's eyes followed the text of The Lion and the Jewel, and how his fingers traced the words with a hunger that surpassed mere academic interest. One afternoon, after the final bell had rung and the other students had rushed out to play football in the red dust of the yard, Mr. Okoro called David to his desk. "David," the teacher said, his voice calm. "I watched you during the reading today. You weren't speaking, but your mind was shouting. Why do you hide your voice?" David's hands began to shake. I didn't. Vivi voice. "The tongue can stumble, David, but the soul does not stutter," Mr. Okoro said, handing him a thin, stapled script. "We are putting on a play for the Inter-School Arts Festival. It is a story of a king who lost his crown but found his courage. I want you to audition for the lead." David looked at the script as if it were a live coal. If Uncle Sagan found out he was wasting time on frivolities like drama, the belt would be the least of his worries. Yet, there was something in Mr. Okoro's eyes, a spark of genuine recognition, that David hadn't seen since his father died. For the next 3 months, David lived a double life. By day, he was the invisible servant of the mansion. He scrubbed, he washed, he took the insults, and he ate the scraps. But in the late hours of the night, under the dim glow of a flashlight he had scavenged from the garage, he became a king. He discovered something miraculous. When he spoke the words of the script, when he stepped into the skin of a character who was brave and loud, his stutter vanished. It was as if the mask of the character provided a shield for his wounded psyche. In the silence of his room, he practiced the art of projection, learning to breathe from his diaphragm to calm the racing of his heart. He rehearsed in the kitchen while washing dishes, whispering lines to the rhythm of the scrubbing brush. He practiced his blocking while hanging laundry in the backyard, using the bedsheets as stage curtains. Every moment was a risk. The tension reached a breaking point one humid evening in late 2017. David had been cast as the lead, and Mr. Okoro had given him a wooden staff, a simple prop carved from a sturdy branch, to practice his regal gait. David was in the backyard, the sun setting behind the palm trees, lost in a monologue about justice and restoration. He struck the ground with the staff, his voice clear, ringing out with a power he didn't know he possessed. "I am the son of the lion. My roar shall be heard from the forests to the sea." "Your roar?" A cold, mocking voice sliced through the air. David froze. Uncle Sagan was standing by the back porch, his arms crossed, his face a mask of contempt. He stepped off the porch and walked toward David, his heavy footsteps thudding on the grass. "So, this is what you do while the generator needs oil? You play act? You think you are a king, boy? You are a beggar I picked up from the dirt." Sagan snatched the wooden staff from David's hand. David reached for it, his voice failing him instantly. You and Osilkli, PP please." "This is trash," Sagan said. He placed the staff over his knee and snapped it with a sickening crack. He threw the pieces into the dirt at David's feet. "Go inside. You will stay in the storeroom for 2 days without light. Perhaps then you will remember who you truly are." David didn't cry. He looked at the broken wood, then at his uncle. The fear was there, yes, but for the first time, there was something else, a cold, hard spark of defiance. He picked up the broken pieces of the prop and tucked them into his shirt. The 2 days in the dark storeroom should have broken him. Instead, they forged him. In the pitch black, surrounded by the smell of old tires and engine oil, David didn't sit in fear. He performed. He recited the entire play from memory, over and over again. He realized that Sagan could break the wood, but he couldn't break the lines etched into David's mind. When he emerged, he was different. He was thinner, his eyes were sunken, but his stutter in the house became a deliberate choice rather than a nervous reflex. He gave Sagan the stuttering boy he wanted to see, while saving his true voice for Mr. Okoro's rehearsals. Mr. Okoro saw the change. He saw the bruises on David's arms and the way the boy's chest would heave with palpitations, but he also saw the raw, untapped talent of a master actor. "The festival is in 2 weeks, David," Mr. Okoro whispered during a secret rehearsal. "A talent scout from a British foundation will be there. This is your door. You must run through it." The day of the Interschool Arts Festival arrived in early 2018. Uncle Sagan was away on a business trip to Abuja, and Aunt Beatrice was busy with a society wedding. David took his chance. He finished his chores by noon and ran the 3 miles to the theater, his broken prop taped together and hidden under his shirt. When he stepped onto that stage, the stuttering houseboy died. The audience saw a young king who spoke with the authority of thunder. They saw a boy whose every gesture commanded respect. When the play ended, there was a moment of stunned silence before the auditorium erupted. In the wings, Mr. Okoro was crying. In the front row, a woman from the British Council was frantically taking notes. David won the Best Actor award, but the real prize came a week later, a letter addressed to the school. Because of his performance and his stellar academic record, achieved in the margins of his servitude, David was being offered a full scholarship to a prestigious secondary school in the UK, specializing in communication and arts. The departure was as quiet as his arrival had been loud. He didn't tell Uncle Sagan he was leaving. He didn't ask for permission. With the help of Mr. Okoro, David packed his small nylon bag. On a rainy morning in mid-2018, David stood at the gates of the mansion. He looked back at the house that had tried to swallow his soul. He thought of his mother, still tucked away in a corner of the city, and promised himself he would return for her with a voice that could move mountains. He walked away from the Gilded Cage, the broken wooden staff still in his bag, a reminder that a king is not made by his crown, but by the fire he survives. The transition from the sweltering, humid intensity of a Lagos face-my-face-you tenement and the gilded, suffocating hallways of Uncle Sagan's mansion to the grey, rain-washed cobblestones of London was more than a change of geography, it was a sensory rebirth. For David, the year 2018 began with the roar of a jet engine, a sound that drowned out the echoes of his uncle's belt and the frantic, irregular thumping of his own traumatized heart. As the plane leveled out over the Atlantic, David looked at his hands. They were scarred from years of scrubbing tiles and carrying pure water basins, yet they held the most powerful weapon he had ever possessed, a scholarship letter. Between 2018 and the closing months of 2019, David would undergo a transformation so radical that it defied the logic of his upbringing. This is the story of how the stuttering ghost of Oshodi became the voice of the voiceless. London in the late autumn was a world of muted colors. To a boy raised in the vibrant, chaotic yellows and reds of Nigeria, the UK felt like a film stripped of its saturation. David arrived at the prestigious academy with nothing but a small nylon bag and the broken wooden staff he had salvaged from Sagan's backyard, a relic of his defiance. The first few months were a struggle of the spirit. Though he was thousands of miles away from the mansion, the internal Sagan remained. Whenever a professor called on him, his throat would seize. The heart palpitations, those rhythmic reminders of his trauma, would return with a vengeance. He was the African boy with the brilliant mind and the broken tongue. He chose to study communication and media studies, a choice that baffled his peers. Why would a boy who could barely string a sentence together without gasping for air choose a field defined by speech? "I am not studying how to talk," David wrote in his private journal during a lonely night in the dormitory. "I am studying how to be heard." Throughout 2018, David immersed himself in the mechanics of human speech. He spent hours in the university's phonetics lab, wearing headphones, analyzing the waves of sound. He studied the diaphragm, the intercostal muscles, and the way the brain processes fear before it hits the vocal cords. He realized that his stutter was not a defect of his tongue, but a defense mechanism of his soul. His body was trying to protect him by keeping him quiet, believing that silence was the only way to stay safe from the uncles of the world. He began to treat his own recovery as a script. He worked with speech therapists, but he also drew on the lessons of Mr. Okoro. He practiced masking, adopting different personas to bypass his own anxiety. When he spoke as David the student, he stumbled. But when he spoke as David the consultant, a character he invented in his mind, his voice was as smooth as silk. By early 2019, David's reputation as a brilliant, albeit quiet, strategist had grown. He was offered a prestigious internship at a top-tier consulting firm in London. The climax of this internship came during a high-stakes meeting with a group of investors who were looking to fund developmental projects in West Africa. The lead investor was a man who reminded David painfully of his uncle, loud, dismissive, and convinced that money bought the right to be cruel. When David stood up to present his communication strategy for a youth outreach program in Lagos, the investor interrupted him. "Why is the intern speaking?" the man sneered. He looks like he's about to faint. David felt the familiar cold sweat. His heart began its frantic gallop. The room blurred. For a second, he was 7 years old again, standing in the rain, smelling of exhaust fumes. Then, he reached into his briefcase and touched the jagged edge of the broken wooden staff he kept with him. He didn't stutter. He didn't flinch. He leaned into the microphone, his voice resonating with a depth that silenced the room. "I am speaking," David said, his tone icy and precise, "because I have walked the streets you're only looking at on a map. I am speaking because the children you want to reach don't need your pity, they need a platform. And if you cannot hear that, you are wasting your money." The room went silent. The investor sat back, stunned. By the end of the hour, David hadn't just secured the funding, he had secured his identity. The boy who was told he was nothing had just dictated the terms to their everything. In mid-2019, David returned to Nigeria. He didn't go to a hotel. He went straight to the "Face Me I Face You" apartment where he had left his mother. The reunion was a quiet explosion of emotion. Grace was older, her hair silvered by the stress of years, but she was alive. With his first major paycheck from his consulting work, David didn't buy a sports car or a watch. He bought a small, beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood and hired the best doctors in Lagos to treat her ailment. "You came back," she whispered, her hands trembling as she touched his face. "I never left, Mama," David replied, his voice clear and steady. "I was just finding the words to bring you home." The final piece of his healing occurred in late 2019. Word had spread about the miracle consultant who was helping NGOs and orphanages across Africa. One afternoon, a man arrived at David's new office in Victoria Island. It was Uncle Segun. He looked diminished. The each-for-himself philosophy had caught up to him. His business had soured, his friends had vanished, and his health was failing. He didn't recognize the man behind the desk as the boy he had beaten in the storeroom. "I heard you help people," Segun said, his voice raspy. "I need a consultant to help me rebrand, to save my reputation." David sat in the shadows, watching the man who had tried to erase him. He could have shouted. He could have called the police. He could have mocked him. Instead, David stood up and walked into the light. He spoke, and for the first time in Segun's presence, he did not stutter. "I will help you, Uncle," David said. Segun gasped, recognizing the eyes of the boy. "But not with your business. I will help you by showing you what you failed to see. You taught me that the world is a cruel place where only the loudest survive. I am here to prove you wrong. I am here to show you that the quietest voices are the ones that carry the most weight." David didn't take his money. He pointed him toward the door, not with anger, but with a profound, soul-deep indifference. Segun was no longer a giant, he was just a man. As 2019 drew to a close, David stood on the balcony of his own office. He was now a public speaking coach and consultant, but his true passion lay in the foundations he built for the discarded. He spent his weekends in orphanages, not just giving out food, but teaching children how to breathe, how to project, and how to tell their own stories. He told them about a boy who sold water and lived in a mansion of shadows. He told them that their trauma was not a period at the end of their sentence, but a comma in a much longer, more beautiful story. The heart palpitations had stopped. The stutter was a ghost of the past. As the Lagos sun set, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and triumphant orange, David realized that his father's uniform had represented authority, but his own voice represented something greater, freedom. He looked at the broken wooden staff, now mounted in a glass case on his wall. It was no longer a symbol of what was broken, but a testament to what had been built. The boy who was forbidden to speak had finally finished his script. As the final echoes of David's story fade into the vibrant Lagos sunset, we are reminded that every scar is a map to a hidden strength and every silence is merely a prelude to a more powerful song. David's journey from the dust-choked markets of Oshodi to the gleaming mahogany of international boardrooms is not just a story of survival. It is a testament to the indestructible nature of the human spirit. If this narrative touched your heart, if you felt the rhythm of his racing chest or the triumph of his first clear word on that school stage, I invite you to become a permanent part of this storytelling community. Please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who is currently walking through their own gilded cage. Your support helps these stories of resilience reach the people who need them most, those who feel invisible, those who have been told they are nothing, and those who are currently searching for the courage to speak their truth. I want to hear from you in the comments section below. We are a global family of dreamers and creators, and your voice is the heartbeat of this channel. What was the moment that stayed with you the most? Was it the heartbreaking midnight bargain in the dead of night, or the quiet, powerful mercy David showed to a broken Uncle Segun in the end? Perhaps you have faced your own broken props in life. Tell us your story of overcoming. Your words might be the light someone else needs to find their way out of the dark. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We are just getting started, and I have so many more worlds to build and characters to introduce to you. By subscribing, you ensure that you are there for every step of the journey, from the first spark of an idea to the final, emotional conclusion. I am already preparing the next narrative, but I want you to decide where we go next. I am deeply curious to know which of these paths you want to explore with me. Cast your vote in the comments or suggest a topic of your own. Times The Silent Partner, a high-stakes corporate thriller set in the tech hubs of Nairobi, Kenya, following a brilliant young woman who must outsmart a corrupt CEO to reclaim the invention that could change the continent. Times The Border Crossing, a gritty, emotional drama centered on two brothers separated during a midnight escape at the volatile border between KPG, Benin, and Lagos, Nigeria. Times The Last Cocoa Harvest, a family mystery layered with secrets and old magic, set deep within the lush, emerald plantations of San Pedro, Ivory Coast. Times The Gold of Obwazi, a suspenseful tale of an undercover journalist risking everything to expose a multimillion-dollar conspiracy in the mining heart of Ghana. Whether you are watching from the bustling streets of Lome, Togo, the coastal beauty of Abidjan, the historic neighborhoods of Accra, or from far across the seas in Paris, Houston, or Toronto, thank you for being here. This channel is a bridge between our cultures and our shared human experiences, and I am honored to have you as a passenger on this creative voyage. Stay tuned. The next story is already breathing, waiting for the right moment to be told. Until then, keep your head high, find your voice, and remember, your story is only just beginning.